The silence was the point. I had purchased it, invested in it, curated it. It was a silence composed of the rustle of autumn leaves on asphalt, the distant hum of a lawnmower, and the gentle sigh of the wind through the manicured oak trees of Willow Creek Estates. After a career spent in the ceaseless, high-frequency scream of server farms and the relentless pressure of zero downtime environments, this quiet was the most valuable commodity I owned. I had traded a life of digital chaos for this small beige house, a tangible asset in a world where my previous work had been entirely ethereal. My goal was simple: to exist, unnoticed, and to be close to my father. He was the anchor of my new, quiet life, residing 5 miles away in the hushed, sterile halls of the Northwood Regional Medical Center. His existence was now a testament to medical technology, a fragile life sustained by the rhythmic pulse and hiss of machines I understood on a schematic level. This move, this quest for suburban serenity, was a logistical and emotional necessity. The daily pilgrimage to his bedside was now a 10-minute drive, not an hour-long battle with traffic. My world had shrunk to the space between this garden I was trying not to kill and the ICU room where I'd sit for hours, reading aloud to a man who could no longer hear me. Peace wasn't a preference. It was the only way to endure the slow-motion grief. The doorbell, a sharp, discordant two-tone chime, felt like a physical assault on the tranquility I was cultivating. I opened it to a woman who seemed to generate her own turbulent atmosphere. She stood on my porch as if she owned it, a rigid figure in her late 50s, with a helmet of blonde hair so lacquered it looked like it could withstand a Category 3 hurricane. Her salmon-colored polo shirt, stretched taut across her chest, bore the weeping willow logo of Willow Creek Estates. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, conducted a swift, critical audit of my entryway. Alexander Jensen. Her voice was a thin, powerful blade, shaping my name into an indictment. "Alex is fine," I managed, attempting a neighborly smile. It felt clumsy, an expression my facial muscles were no longer accustomed to. The smile was not returned. "I am Carol Covington, president of the Homeowners Association." She spoke the title with the gravitas of a CEO announcing quarterly earnings, a strange, misplaced formality that immediately set my teeth on edge. Her gaze dropped to my welcome mat, lingered for a half-second of silent condemnation, then snapped back to me. "I'm here regarding the compliance violation." I blinked. "Violation? I've been here less than 3 weeks." A neighbor, a friendly man named George from 2 houses down, had warned me about her in a hushed tone while I was wrestling a lawnmower out of my trunk. "Watch out for Carol," he'd said with a nervous chuckle. "She used to run a shipping empire downtown. Got pushed out. Now she runs Willow Creek like it's her last hostile takeover. Just keep your head down." The probationary period for new residents is precisely when we on the board find it most effective to establish a baseline of conformity, she said, her vocabulary as starched as her collar. She produced a clipboard, her movements economical and sharp. Article 4, Section B, Subsection 12 of the Willow Creek Covenants, conditions and restrictions explicitly mandates that all front-facing trim eaves, window frames, and door surrounds must be rendered in a color from the pre-approved community architectural palette. I glanced at my own door frame. It was painted a perfectly pleasant, unassuming shade of cream. I knew for a fact it was compliant, because the previous owners had left 3 cans of it in the garage, the label clearly reading Willow Creek Estates Approved, Swiss Coffee. "I'm fairly certain it's an approved color," I said, my tone even. "The cans are in the garage." A flicker of something not anger, but a cold, dismissive impatience crossed her face. The Swiss coffee palette designation was sunsetted by the Architectural Review Committee at the end of the last fiscal quarter. The approved shade is now alabaster shell. Your property is therefore out of compliance and visually discordant with the established community standard. The corporate jargon, sunsetting. Fiscal quarter. Community standard sounded utterly bizarre in the context of house paint. George's warning echoed in my mind. This wasn't a neighborhood gossip. This was a deposed queen ruling a miniature five-street kingdom with the same ruthless obsession for control that had likely defined her previous life. I stared at her, waiting for a hint of irony, a crack in the facade. There was none. "So, you're telling me," I said slowly, "that I am required to repaint all of my trim because the HOA committee voted to change the name of the approved shade of off-white. Alabaster shell possesses a lower luminosity value and a subtly warmer chroma," she retorted, as if explaining a complex financial derivative to an imbecile. "The difference is critical for maintaining the portfolio value of our collective real estate assets. A formal notice of non-compliance has been issued. You have 14 business days to rectify. Failure to do so will result in a $50 daily penalty. Good day, Mr. Jensen." She pivoted with military precision and marched down my walkway, her back ramrod straight. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a case study in displaced ambition. A woman who once commanded fleets of trucks was now commanding color palettes. I had spent my entire career designing complex, logical systems to protect critical infrastructure from irrational threats. And now, an irrational threat stood on my doorstep, not with a virus or a brute force attack, but with a clipboard and a paint swatch. I closed the door, the carefully constructed silence of my new life, already feeling fragile and thin. This wasn't going to be a simple skirmish. This was a territorial dispute with a predator who had lost her jungle and was now viciously defending the birdbath. The official notice arrived on embossed, heavyweight cardstock, a tactile representation of its own self-importance. The language was a stilted fusion of legalese and corporate mission statement prose, outlining my failure to adhere to community-wide aesthetic protocols. For a fleeting moment, I considered fighting it on principle. I could write a letter, cite the fact that I had purchased the house under the assumption its existing state was compliant. But my energy was a finite resource, and every ounce of it was reserved for my father. This was a battle I didn't have the strength to fight. Winning, I reasoned, was simply making the problem go away. So, I yielded. I went to the hardware store and purchased 2 gallons of alabaster shell. As the employee mixed the paint, I held the 2 color swatches, Swiss coffee and alabaster shell, side by side under the bright store lights. They were, to the human eye, identical. It was a perfect metaphor for Carol's reign, a meaningless distinction enforced with absolute authority. I spent a grueling Saturday on a ladder, methodically painting over the perfectly good trim with a functionally identical color. It felt like a ritual of subservience. I documented my capitulation with a series of high-resolution photos, which I emailed to the HOA board with a polite, concise message. The trim has been repainted per your notice. My compliance, I soon learned, was not the desired outcome. For Carol, the process was the point. The exercise of power, not the resolution, was her objective. By obeying, I had merely validated her authority, signaling that I was a subject who could be managed. The notices began to arrive with the regularity of a weekly subscription service. The next violation was my lawn. Turf height nonconformity. A grainy, zoomed-in photograph accompanied the letter, showing a ruler plunged into my grass. The blades tickled the 3.25-inch mark. The bylaws, it seemed, stipulated a maximum height of 3 inches. The timestamp on the photo was 5:48 a.m. The image of this woman, this former CEO, creeping onto my lawn in the pre-dawn gloom with a ruler was both pathetic and deeply unsettling. A $50 fine was attached. That night, after a long and draining evening at the hospital, where my father had developed a slight fever, I did a little research. It wasn't hard to find information on Carolyn Covington. A series of articles from the city's business journal told a dramatic story. She had inherited Covington Logistics from her father and built it into a regional powerhouse. She was described as uncompromising, visionary, and ruthless. Then, the articles took a darker turn. A story from 2 years ago detailed a brutal, hostile takeover, orchestrated by her own board of directors and a rival firm. She had been publicly and humiliatingly ousted from the company that bore her family name. The final article was a small, gossipy piece about her retreat into managing her local HOA with the same iron fist that once ruled the shipping lanes. Suddenly, her every action clicked into place. The absurd formality, the obsession with rules, the joyless exercise of power. It was all a desperate attempt to reconstruct the kingdom she had lost. Willow Creek Estates was her new corporation, and we residents were her employees, her assets to be managed. Her harassment wasn't random. It was a deeply pathological performance of her former identity. This new understanding shifted my strategy. She was a predictable system, so I treated her as such. I bought a new lawnmower with hyper-precise settings and cut the lawn to exactly 2.8 inches. I photographed the result, embedding the metadata, and saved it to a new, encrypted folder on my secure drive. I labeled the folder Covington Asset Management. The violations became more creative, more personal. A warning for a suboptimally coiled garden hose. A fine for my recycling bin being placed with the logo facing the street instead of the house. A violation of an obscure bylaw that felt like it had been written that morning. Each time, I complied, and each time, I documented. My folder grew, a meticulous archive of her escalating madness scans of the notices, receipts for the fines, time-stamped photographs of my compliance. It was the same process I used to use when tracking a persistent digital threat: log everything, build a pattern, and wait for the attacker to make a critical error. The error came in the form of my father's garden gnome, a cheerful, ceramic figure he'd given me years ago. It was the one whimsical object in my otherwise sterile existence. I'd placed it among the hostas, a small, private memorial to a man who was still alive. The notice arrived, citing a violation of the aesthetic cohesion mandate, which forbade decorative items of a non-standard or fantastical nature. The fine was $100. This was different. It wasn't about grass or bins. This was a direct attack on a symbol of my father. I wrote a polite appeal, explaining its sentimental value. Carol's reply was swift and cold. An email sent directly from her account. Sentimental value is not a depreciable asset recognized by the board. The violation stands. The next morning, the gnome was on my doorstep, shattered into a dozen pieces. There was no note, no proof, just a pile of broken ceramic and the lingering ghost of her perfume in the morning air. It was a message, delivered with the same impersonal cruelty she might have once used to shut down an unprofitable branch of her company. Your personal attachments are irrelevant to the operational needs of this system. I carefully collected the pieces, my hand steady. The detached analyst in me took over. I photographed the fragments, uploaded the image to my folder, and created a new subfolder titled Property Damage. The game had changed. She had escalated from bureaucratic pressure to criminal action. And she had done it, She believed without leaving a trace. She had no idea that she was performing for an audience of one, an audience who was not only watching, but recording her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to present the evidence to a new board of directors. The smashed gnome was a declaration. Carol had breached the unspoken boundary between bureaucratic harassment and physical aggression. Her belief in its deniability was her shield. She was an executive who knew how to delegate dirty work, or, in this case, do it herself under the cloak of darkness, assuming the same rules of plausible deniability applied here as they did in the corporate world. My passive strategy of compliance and documentation was no longer sufficient. It was time to upgrade my defenses. It was time to put eyes on the asset. My previous career was not in IT, as Carol's flawed research would later suggest. I designed and implemented layered security architectures for environments where the cost of a breach was measured in lives, not dollars. Hospital networks, research labs, data centers for critical infrastructure. Ordering a consumer-grade security camera felt like using a child's toy to guard Fort Knox. I spent an evening on my encrypted laptop, accessing a secure portal for a wholesale supplier I hadn't used in 3 years. My old login still worked. I ordered 3 multispectrum microdome cameras, the size of a hockey puck, capable of capturing clear facial details in near total darkness from over 100 yards. I ordered a networked video recorder NVR with a solid-state drive and a built-in, uninterruptible power supply. I also purchased several passive infrared motion sensors and a spool of shielded Cat6a cable. To anyone looking at the purchase order, it would seem like a setup for a small bank. For me, it was the minimum acceptable standard for monitoring a single, determined threat. The installation took a full weekend. I crawled through the hot, dusty attic, running cables with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The cameras were mounted discreetly under the eaves, their dark lenses almost invisible against the alabaster shell paint. One provided a wide-angle view of the entire street. The second focused on my lawn and walkway. The third was trained like a sniper on the small garden bed where the gnome had been executed. I networked everything to the NVR in my office closet and configured it to perform continuous, encrypted, off-site backups to a private server I still leased in Switzerland. Data integrity was paramount. As I was configuring the motion detection zones on the software interface, a task that felt as familiar as breathing, I called my former colleague, Marcus. He now ran a successful cybersecurity consultancy, a job that paid him handsomely to be professionally paranoid. "Alex, don't tell me you're calling for a job. I thought you'd be knee-deep in petunias by now," he said, his voice a welcome shot of cynical normalcy. "The petunias are under constant threat," I said dryly, tweaking the sensitivity of the perimeter sensors. "Quick question. Marcus, I'm building a private surveillance grid. I need to know if the latest firmware for the A7 NVR patches, the exploit that allowed for the creation of silent, secondary recording streams that aren't visible on the primary user log." Marcus went quiet for a second. "Okay, that's a question I haven't heard in a while. That exploit was part of the Ghost protocol we designed for the DoD project. Why on earth would you need to run a Ghost stream on a residential setup? Who are you watching? The CIA?" "Just the head of my HOA," I said. "And I don't just want to record her. I want a complete, tamper-proof chain of evidence that she herself can't even detect if she were to somehow gain access to the system. I need a log file of my own log files." "You always were a paranoid bastard, Alex," he laughed. "And that's why you were the best. No, they never patched it. The firmware update was focused on user interface improvements, not deep core architecture. The vulnerability is still there if you know the access code. You're building a legal case, aren't you? A real one." Let's just say I'm preparing a comprehensive performance review for a particularly toxic executive. I replied, "Thanks, Marcus. I owe you one." "Just be careful," Marcus warned, his tone shifting. "You're walking a fine line. A system that robust could be seen as an invasion of privacy, even if it's on your own property. If this ever goes to court, make sure your data is unimpeachable, but also make damn sure your methods are defensible." It was a valid warning. The legal risks were real, but the threat was imminent, and I was willing to take a calculated risk. The trap was now active. I didn't have to wait long for the quarry to wander into it. The first alert buzzed on my phone at 2:13 a.m., a few nights later. The system's AI, which I'd programmed to recognize specific behavioral patterns, flagged the event human loitering, Zone 2, driveway, behavior profile consistent with vandalism. I watched the live infrared feed from my bed. The image was as clear as day. It was Carol, clad in a dark tracksuit, her movements quick and furtive. She knelt by the rear tire of my car, pulled a small, glinting object from her pocket. It looked like an ice pick, and plunged it into the sidewall of the tire. She gave a small, satisfied nod and scurried back to her house. The act took less than 30 seconds. The next morning, I calmly called for roadside assistance. At the tire shop, I obtained a written statement from the mechanic confirming the puncture was a deliberate, irreparable act of vandalism. I scanned the receipt and the statement, and filed them away in the property damage subfolder, alongside the high-definition video of the event, which I labeled Covington Tire Vandalism Jo1.mp4. A week later, she stole a package from my porch. It was a box of books I'd ordered for my father, large print histories I would read to him. The system logged the delivery. Then, 10 minutes later, logged Carol marching up my walkway, seizing the box and retreating. The footage was damning. The act itself was petty, but it demonstrated a profound level of arrogance and contempt. She was no longer just enforcing rules. She was committing brazen, indictable crimes. I didn't confront her. I didn't report it to the police. Not yet. A single incident is an accusation. A documented pattern is a conviction. Marcus's warning stayed with me. My methods had to be as clean as my evidence. Confronting her would only make her more cautious. My best strategy was to remain the quiet, seemingly defeated victim. Let her believe she was winning. Let her grow bolder. I was no longer just defending my property. I was building a cage for her, bar by meticulous, data-driven bar. Every crime she committed was another lock on the door. Having failed to provoke me through minor vandalism, Carol shifted her strategy from my property to my reputation. It was a classic corporate maneuver. If you can't oust a rival through direct means, you poison their reputation within the organization. Her chosen venue was the digital town square, the Willow Creek Estates private Facebook group, a seemingly benign forum for sharing zucchini bread recipes and complaining about parked cars. For Carol, it was a powerful tool for propaganda and control. I rarely checked the group, but one evening, sitting in the uncomfortable visitor's chair in my father's ICU room, the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator, a constant backdrop, I scrolled through the feed out of sheer boredom. That's when I saw it. It was a post from Carol, crafted with the passive-aggressive subtlety of a wrecking ball. "Just a general community announcement," she began, the post accompanied by a slightly blurry photo of my house. "It's so important that we all remain aligned with the core values and community standards that protect the investment we've all made in our homes. It has come to the board's attention that certain new residents may not fully appreciate the collaborative spirit of Willow Creek. A repeated disregard for our established bylaws is not just an aesthetic issue. It's a sign of disrespect that erodes the very fabric of our community. We must all work to identify and correct these weak links. The corporate speak was unmistakable, aligned. Core values. Collaborative spirit. She was framing my existence as a threat to their collective stock price. The comments beneath the post were a sickening cascade of sycophantic agreement. Well said, Carol. Some people just don't get it. Is that the house on Elm? I knew he was trouble. So standoffish. I heard he got fired from his last job. Probably has an issue with authority. My hands tightened on my phone. The injustice was breathtaking. My standoffish nature was a shield against overwhelming grief. My issue with authority was a quiet refusal to engage with her insanity. She had taken the raw material of my private pain and skillfully woven it into a public narrative of me as a dangerous outsider. It was a masterclass in small-scale psychological warfare. With methodical calm, I began to screenshot everything. Every post, every libelous comment, every backpatting like. I saved them to a new subfolder in my Covington Asset Management file, labeled Disinformation Campaign. I ran a simple script to map the social connections within the group, quickly identifying her key lieutenants, a small clique of residents who were the most vocal amplifiers of her narrative. The campaign intensified. A few days later, a new post from Carol appeared, Public Safety Alert. There have been reports of package thefts from porches recently. Please be extra vigilant. We recommend security cameras. It's a shame that we can no longer trust all our neighbors. Keep your doors locked. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was stunning. She was preemptively accusing me of the very crime I had on video of her committing. She was seeding the idea that I was a thief to provide cover for her own actions. It was a classic disinformation tactic, create so much noise and confusion that the real truth becomes impossible to discern. The digital slander soon bled into the real world. Neighbors who once offered a polite nod now stared through me. The casual morning wave from the man walking his golden retriever was replaced with a suspicious glare. I was being socially excommunicated. The annual neighborhood barbecue was held on a lawn across the street from my house. I watched from my window as Carol, holding a spatula like a scepter, led a toast, her eyes flicking towards my house with a look of undisguised triumph. I was the ghost at the feast, a topic of whispered conversation. That evening, I got a call from General Miller, my first boss on a long-forgotten DoD contract. We had stayed in touch. Two retirees from a world of high-stakes secrets. Alex, his gruff voice crackled. You sound like hell. That quiet life, not all it's cracked up to be. You could say that, sir, I replied, watching the party across the street. I'm currently the target of a surprisingly effective psychological operations campaign. I explained the situation in broad strokes, the HOA president, the harassment, the social media attacks. The general was silent for a moment. It's a classic deposed leader profile. Alex, we saw it a dozen times in failed states. When they lose their real power, they find a smaller pond and try to become a shark again. They can't build, so they destroy. They manufacture an enemy to consolidate their new, pathetic power base. This woman, she's not just a nuisance. She's unstable, and cornered animals are dangerous. I agree, I said, but her methods are textbook. It's almost amateurish. The tactics are sound, but the execution is clumsy. She's leaving a massive data trail. Just don't underestimate her, the general warned. People like that are capable of anything when their fragile ego is threatened. You're doing the right thing by documenting everything. Build your case so airtight that when you finally present it, it's not a trial. It's a sentencing. But for God's sake, watch your back. His words resonated long after I hung up. He was right. I was dealing with a predictable but unstable subject. The social isolation was wounding, but it was also a symptom of her desperation. She was expanding the battlefield, unaware that my own surveillance was expanding with it. Every slanderous post was another piece of evidence, another exhibit in the case I was building against her. She thought she was isolating me. In reality, she was isolating herself, surrounding herself with a wall of lies that would eventually come crashing down. Having successfully poisoned the social well, Carol moved to her next strategic objective, leveraging state power against me. Her own authority was limited to fines and nasty Facebook posts. To inflict real, meaningful damage, she needed to co-opt the legitimate authority of the city. She began to use municipal services as her personal harassment hotline, launching a series of anonymous, false reports designed to make my life a bureaucratic nightmare. The first salvo came from the city's code enforcement department. A tired-looking officer arrived at my door on a Tuesday, his expression one of profound resignation. He explained he was there to investigate an anonymous complaint regarding an unpermitted hazardous structure in my backyard. The structure in question was my barbecue grill. The complainant alleges this is an illegal outdoor kitchen constructed without permits, the officer said, gesturing at the Weber grill with his pen, his voice devoid of emotion. I explained that it was a portable, wheeled appliance, not a structure, and that its placement adhered to all fire safety codes. The officer knew it was a bogus call. He sighed, scribbled on his clipboard, and apologized for wasting my time. "No apology necessary," I said, my tone polite but firm. "However, for your records, this is the fourth official inquiry I've received based on anonymous complaints in the last 2 months. I have reason to believe they originate from a single, malicious source. The misuse of city resources for personal harassment is a serious issue. I have extensive, date-stamped security logs I would be happy to provide to the city if you were to open an investigation into the matter. I believe Municipal Code 14.2b addresses such misuse." The officer's weary expression sharpened with surprise. He was used to dealing with angry homeowners, not someone who calmly quoted city ordinances and offered to provide digital evidence. "You've done your homework," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "I'll make a note of it in my report. This kind of thing clogs up our whole system." I immediately filed an online public records request for his official report. When it arrived, I added it to my Covington file, under a new subfolder, Weaponization of Authorities. 2 weeks later, it was Animal Control, responding to a frantic, anonymous tip about a neglected pit bull chained in my backyard. I don't own a pet. The responding officer was deeply apologetic when she found my pristine, dog-free yard. "We've had a spike in false calls from this neighborhood," she confided, clearly frustrated. "It pulls us away from animals who actually need our help." I got her name and filed another records request. The calls became a regular part of my life. The police were dispatched to my home for a loud party with possible underage drinking on a Saturday night, when the house was dark and my phone's GPS data, along with my hospital visitor pass, could prove I was sitting by my father's bedside. The officers were professional, but visibly irritated by the wild goose chase. Each time, I was calm, polite, and cooperative. I provided them with my evidence, mentioned the previous false reports, and created a clear, cross-referenced pattern of harassment, not just for my own files, but for the police departments as well. Carol's fatal miscalculation, the act that transcended harassment and became truly monstrous, was the call she made to Adult Protective Services, a social worker, A kind-faced woman who looked emotionally exhausted arrived at my home one afternoon. She explained, with considerable embarrassment, that she was legally obligated to investigate a highly detailed anonymous report alleging that I was neglecting an infirm, elderly man living at my address. The report claimed I was keeping him isolated, that strange odors were emanating from the house, and that he was in grave danger. A cold, precise rage, unlike anything I had felt before, settled over me. "My father," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "is not here. He is a patient in the intensive care unit at Northwood Regional Medical Center. He is on full life support. His primary physician is Dr. Eris Thorne. I suggest you contact the hospital immediately to verify his status and location." The social worker's professional composure crumbled. "Mr. Jensen, I am so sorry," she stammered, her eyes wide with shock and sympathy. "The report it was clearly malicious. This is unconscionable." "Yes," I said, "it is." This was the point of no return. To use my father's tragic, vulnerable state as a weapon to twist my grief and duty into a vile accusation of neglect was an act of profound moral depravity. This was no longer about a power-hungry ex-CEO. This was about a human being utterly devoid of empathy or decency. She had crossed a sacred line. I gave the social worker all the information she needed. She promised to close the case and flag the complainant in their system as a source of malicious reports. After she left, I stood on my porch in the quiet afternoon sun. The serene suburban landscape now felt menacing, a facade for the ugliness it concealed. The data-gathering phase was over. Carol Covington had just provided me with the final, most damning piece of evidence of her character. She had declared war not on a quiet neighbor, but on a son, and she had no possible conception of the righteous, methodical fury she had just unleashed. This was no longer about winning an HOA dispute. This was about total, systemic annihilation. The escalating failures must have pushed Carol to a breaking point. Her attempts to use the city's authority against me had not only failed, but had backfired, likely marking her as a nuisance caller across multiple departments. The intricate web of control she had tried to weave was unraveling. From my study of psychological profiles in my former career, I knew this was the most dangerous moment. A narcissist, deprived of their power, does not retreat. They double down, seeking a final decisive confrontation to reassert their dominance. They will risk everything on one last desperate move. I prepared for it. My home security system was no longer just a passive recording device. I fine-tuned the analytics, setting up more aggressive alerts for any approach to my property. I varied my schedule, my routes to the hospital, breaking any predictable pattern. I was hardening the target, anticipating a final, direct assault. It came on a Thursday evening, cloaked in the deceptive calm of twilight. I had just returned from Northwood. The sterile hospital sent a familiar ghost on my clothes. My father's condition had been stable but fragile, and the emotional weight of the day was heavy. I was standing in my kitchen, staring blankly into the refrigerator, when I saw her through the window. She wasn't skulking. She was marching across my lawn with the purposeful stride of an invading general. There was no clipboard, no pretense of official business. This was personal. I met her at the door, opening it before her fist could make contact. The 4K camera nestled in the eave above was already recording, its silent lens capturing every detail. "Carol," I said, my voice a flat, neutral tone. "Don't you dare use my name, you pathetic little man," she hissed. Her face was flushed, her eyes burning with a zealot's fire. Her carefully constructed corporate composure had completely disintegrated. "I know all about you. I've done my due diligence." I remained silent, my body framed in the doorway, a calm and immovable object. "You're a nobody," she sneered, stepping closer, invading my personal space. "A low-level IT clerk who got fired for insubordination. I've seen your type my whole career. Little men who resent powerful women, who chip away at the foundations of what we build. You come into my community, my world, and you think you can defy me." Her research was a fantasy, a narrative she had constructed from the digital breadcrumbs I had intentionally left behind years ago as a professional smokescreen. She had found the story she wanted to find: a weak, insignificant man she was entitled to crush. It was this profound underestimation that had been her critical error from the very beginning. "This is not your community, Carol," I said quietly. "You don't own it." "I built it," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Just like I built my company, I created order from chaos. I established the rules that give this place value. And you, with your defiance and your secrets, you threaten all of it." Then, her voice dropped, the shift in tone more chilling than her rage. It became a low, conspiratorial whisper. "But I know your weakness. I know all about your father. So sad. Lying up there in that hospital, taking up space." The blood in my veins turned to ice. "I still have connections," she purred, her eyes gleaming with a sick, triumphant light. "Real power. Friends on the hospital's board of trustees. They value my opinion. They know I'm a pillar of this community. It would be a profound tragedy if your father's long-term care plan was to be reevaluated. Resources are so limited. You know, sometimes difficult decisions must be made about patients who are no longer a viable asset, patients whose families cause disruptions." There it was, not a veiled threat, a promise. She was explicitly threatening to interfere with my dying father's medical care as leverage in a neighborhood dispute. She was going to attempt a hostile takeover of his life. In that instant, any remaining shred of detachment I possessed vanished, burned away by a white-hot, protective rage. But on the outside, I was perfectly still. I let her see nothing. I let her interpret my silence as shock, as fear. I let her believe she had finally found the lever that would break me. Her mistake was in seeing my father as a weakness. He wasn't. He was my purpose. He was my strength. And she had just threatened the very core of my world. "You have 1 week," she declared, her voice ringing with the finality of a judgment. "1 week to put this house on the market and disappear. If I see a for sale sign on this lawn by next Thursday, I might forget to make that phone call. If not..." She left the threat hanging in the air, a poisonous vapor. She turned and walked away, a victor leaving a conquered field. She had no idea that she hadn't delivered a checkmate. She had just moved her queen directly into the line of fire. The game of observation was over. She had just given me cause, motive, and a direct threat that would justify any and all countermeasures. The system was no longer passive. It was now fully, terrifyingly active. The explicit threat against my father's life was a tactical error of catastrophic proportions on Carol's part. It transformed the situation from a matter of civil harassment into an active conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, or worse. It gave me the moral and, I would argue, legal justification to move from a defensive to an offensive posture. She thought she had cornered me. In reality, she had liberated me from my self-imposed restraint. For the next 48 hours, I let the silence be my answer. No for sale sign appeared on my lawn. I let her simmer in her perceived victory, imagining my panic. My real work, however, had shifted from my quiet suburban street to the sprawling digital infrastructure of the Northwood Regional Medical Center. My old life, the one I had tried to escape, was about to become my greatest weapon. I spent my days at the hospital, not just in my father's room, but refamiliarizing myself with the physical layout. I observed staff protocols, security patrol routes, and shift change timings. On my tablet, I wasn't just browsing news sites, I was probing the outer defenses of the hospital's network. It was my architecture, my design, the Aegis Integrated Hospital Solutions platform. But it had been years. New patches, new administrators, new protocols would have been layered on top of my core code. My old administrative credentials, Jensen, sysadmin alpha, were dormant, archived deep within the system. Reactivating them was a significant risk. If caught, I could face serious federal charges for unauthorized access to a protected computer system. It was hacking, plain and simple, even if I was hacking my own creation. But the threat was credible and imminent. It was a risk I had to take. I started by calling Marcus. "I have a situation," I said, foregoing any pleasantries. "I need to reactivate an archived alpha-level credential on an Aegis system, version 4.5. But I need to do it without tripping the new audit protocols the C-suite implemented last year. I need a ghost in the machine." "Jesus, Alex," Marcus breathed. "That's not a ghost. That's raising the dead. The new audit system is a beast. It flags any legacy credential reactivation and locks it down within seconds. What's going on?" "A direct and credible threat against a patient's life. My father's," I said. "The threat is from an external actor who believes they have influence over the hospital board and intends to interfere with his care." There was a pause. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice now deadly serious. "Forget the legalities. This is a moral imperative. There's a potential workaround, a flaw in the diagnostic port emulation I discovered during a penetration test last year. You can't reactivate your old profile, but you can create a temporary, sandboxed root-level instance that mirrors your old alpha permissions. It'll give you full system control, but the instance will decay in 90 seconds. Once you're in, you'll have to work fast to whitelist your own credentials for sustained access. I'll send you the injection string. But Alex, if you mistype a single character, the whole network will lock down and flag you as a hostile intruder." The stakes were clear. A ticking clock and zero room for error. I spent the next day memorizing the complex alphanumeric string Marcus sent me, practicing it on a virtual machine until the sequence was burned into my muscle memory. On Saturday afternoon, I sat in the bustling hospital cafeteria, a strategic location with access to a public Wi-Fi node that I could use to mask my entry point. I initiated the attack. My fingers flew across the virtual keyboard on my tablet. I injected Marcus's code. For a terrifying 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a new window opened on my screen. Root instance 7B gamma initialized. T-minus 90 seconds. I was in. I navigated through the system's core directories with blinding speed, my old knowledge of the architecture serving me perfectly. I found my archived sysadmin alpha profile, bypassed the dormancy lock, and assigned it to the active user group. I whitelisted its access across all security partitions, effectively making my ghost key a permanent master key once more. With 5 seconds to spare, I terminated the root instance just as it began to decay. I held my breath. No alarms. No lockdown. I was in. I was a ghost. And the hospital was my playground. My first act was to create a new, hyper-specific security protocol around my father's room. ICU 412. I designated his life support machinery as a priority Omega asset. I wrote a quick script that would trigger a silent alarm, sent only to my personal devices, if the control panel of any of those machines was accessed by anyone whose credentials were not on a pre-approved list of his direct medical staff. The alarm would also automatically activate full audio and video recording from the room's high-resolution camera, streaming it to my secure Swiss server. The trap was set. The alert came less than an hour later. A discreet notification on my tablet. Priority Omega Alert. Unauthorized access attempt. ICU room 412. Asset ventilator control interface. I tapped the screen, and the live feed appeared. It was Carol. She had somehow bluffed or snuck her way into the ICU and slipped into my father's room while the nurse was occupied. She stood over my father, her face a mask of vindictive rage. Her hand reached for the ventilator's main power button. "This will teach you to disrespect the HOA. You son of a bitch!" Her voice hissed, captured in perfect clarity by the room's microphone. My blood ran cold, but my actions were hot, precise. I had full control. I triggered a code-strong lockdown of the entire ICU wing. Heavy magnetic locks slammed shut on every entrance and exit, sealing the entire section of the hospital. Nurses and doctors stopped in their tracks, confused. I routed the live video and audio from room 412 directly to the main security hub and to the tablet of the security chief, Henderson, a man I'd personally trained. My text to him was simple. "Henderson, code strong, ICU, intruder, room 412. Attempted homicide in progress. This is an A, Jensen Priority Alpha. Move now." Simultaneously, I initiated a data burst, sending the entire evidence package, the video of Carol at the ventilator, my complete Covington asset management dossier, to my lawyer and to General Miller's contact at the city police department. Then I rose from my cafeteria table and walked toward the chaos I had just unleashed. I arrived at the sealed glass doors of the ICU to find Henderson and his team trying uselessly to override the lockdown. A crowd was gathering. From inside, I could see a nurse confronting Carol, pulling her away from my father's bed. Carol, seeing the security team, immediately began to scream, pointing at me through the glass. It was him, that man. He tried to kill his own father, and then locked us all in. I saw him. I tried to stop him. Arrest him. It was a brilliant, last-ditch lie, designed to create chaos and doubt. The police were arriving, their faces grim. Henderson looked at me, his face a mask of confusion and stress. This was her final play, a public accusation where her word would stand against mine. I looked at Henderson, then at the police sergeant. "She's lying," I said calmly, "and I have proof." I lifted my tablet and bypassed my own lockdown, the magnetic bolts clicking open. I strode into the ICU, the police and Henderson following close behind. Carol stood her ground, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Officer, do your duty," she commanded. "Sir, you have a lot of explaining to do," the sergeant said to me. "I know," I replied, my voice echoing in the tense, silent corridor. "Henderson, patch my device to the waiting room monitor. Authorization Jensen Alpha 09 Tango." Henderson, recognizing my old command code, nodded grimly into his radio. A moment later, the large screen on the waiting room wall flickered to life. "My name is Alex Jensen," I announced, my voice cutting through the tension. "I was the lead architect of the Aegis security system that runs this entire hospital. I built every line of code that is currently locking these doors and recording every second of what happens in this wing." A wave of shock rippled through the assembled staff. Carol's face went white. I placed a silent alarm on my father's life support, I continued, holding up my tablet. An alarm that was just triggered by that woman. And it came with a recording. I pressed play. The scene from my father's room filled the screen, visible to everyone. Carol's face, twisted with hate, her hand, reaching for the switch, her voice, echoing through the hallway. This will teach you to disrespect the HOA. The world stopped. Every person in that corridor stared, horrified, first at the screen, then at the woman who stood among them. Carol made a small, strangled sound as the last vestiges of her fabricated reality were systematically dismantled by the truth. The police sergeant stepped forward, his handcuffs already in his hand, his expression like stone. Her desperate gamble had failed. She hadn't walked into a hospital. She had walked into my world, a world of absolute data and inescapable logic. And in my world, she had just been rendered a critical system error, permanently quarantined. The aftermath was a swift and brutal lesson in cause and effect. With Carol led away in handcuffs, the hospital security team, acting under my remote guidance, restored normal operations to the ICU. The entire event, from lockdown to arrest, had lasted less than 10 minutes. The video evidence was pristine, absolute, and undeniable. Combined with the comprehensive dossier my lawyer immediately presented to the district attorney, it painted a picture not of a simple assault, but of a calculated, long-term campaign of terror that culminated in attempted murder. The DA, looking at the mountain of evidence, denied bail, citing Carol as an extreme and unpredictable danger to the community. Carol's carefully constructed world collapsed with breathtaking speed, faced with the certainty of a conviction for attempted murder, a charge that carried a life sentence. She accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to aggravated assault, stalking, and multiple counts of criminal vandalism. The judge, after reviewing the case file and watching the chilling video from the hospital room, made his disgust clear. He spoke of her monstrous abuse of a position of trivial power and her utter lack of human decency, sentencing her to the maximum possible term under the plea agreement, 15 years in a state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for 10. Her house, the seat of her tiny kingdom, was sold to pay for her defense. The legal loose ends of my own actions were tied up quietly. The police detective, a friend of General Miller, met with me and Henderson. After reviewing my statement and the clear evidence of an imminent threat to life, my unauthorized access was officially classified as a necessary civilian intervention under exigent circumstances. The hospital board, far from being the source of power Carol had imagined, was horrified. They quietly hired Marcus's firm to conduct a full security audit and, on his recommendation, offered me a lucrative, permanent consultancy contract to oversee the Aegis platform security, which I politely declined. Back in Willow Creek, the revolution was quiet but total. I presented my evidence at an emergency HOA meeting. The videos of her slashing my tire and stealing my package, the screenshots of her lies, the litany of false police and city reports, it was all laid bare. Her cronies on the board resigned in shame. A new board was elected, a group of reasonable neighbors who immediately moved to abolish Carol's labyrinth of vindictive bylaws. The reign of aesthetic terror was over. My life finally found the quiet rhythm I had craved. The glares from neighbors were replaced with apologetic nods and waves. My solitude was no longer a sign of suspicion, but a respected boundary. I spent my days in the garden and my afternoons at my father's bedside. His condition never improved, but the space around him was finally at peace. There were no more threats, no more battles to fight. I had been forced to use the very skills I had sought to escape in order to secure my sanctuary. The war was over. The silence I had fought for was won, and in the quiet hum of my father's life support machines, I finally found my home.